Have you ever wanted something badly, worked toward it for weeks, maybe even months, and then suddenly found yourself doing the exact thing that makes success less likely? You have an important deadline tomorrow, but instead of working, you spend 2 hours doing almost anything else. You finally begin exercising consistently, then one bad week somehow turns into 3 months of doing nothing. You meet someone who genuinely treats you well, yet instead of relaxing into the relationship, you become suspicious, distant, or strangely determined to find something wrong. You receive an opportunity you once dreamed about, and suddenly your mind produces 100 reasons why you're not ready. From the outside, this behavior looks irrational. If you want the outcome, why would you interfere with your own progress? This is the strange psychology of self-sabotage. And one of the biggest misunderstandings about self-sabotage is believing that it means some hidden part of you secretly wants to fail. Usually, the truth is more complicated. Because your mind isn't always trying to maximize achievement. Very often, it is trying to minimize emotional threat. Imagine someone who has spent years telling themselves they want to start a business. Eventually, the opportunity arrives. They have enough savings. They understand the industry. They even have their first potential customers. But instead of launching, they decide they need another course, then a better website, then more research, then a more detailed plan. 6 months later, they're still preparing. They may call this perfectionism, but psychologically, preparation has become something else: protection. As long as the business remains an idea, it cannot fail. Nobody can reject it. Nobody can laugh at it. And perhaps most importantly, the person never has to discover whether they are actually capable of doing what they've imagined. Procrastination protects them from that answer. This is why self-sabotage can feel so confusing. The behavior hurts your future self while protecting your present self. Avoiding the difficult conversation damages the relationship later, but removes anxiety tonight. Not applying for the opportunity guarantees you won't receive it, but it also guarantees you won't experience rejection. Never finishing the project prevents success, but it also prevents judgment. The long-term cost can be enormous. The immediate emotional reward can be tiny, but the brain is remarkably sensitive to immediate relief. You feel anxious. You avoid the thing creating anxiety. The anxiety decreases. And something important has just happened. Your brain learns. Avoidance worked. Not in the sense that it solved the problem. It worked because it changed how you felt. This creates one of the most powerful loops behind self-sabotaging behavior: discomfort, avoidance, relief, then repetition. Each time the cycle repeats, avoiding the uncomfortable situation becomes slightly easier. Facing it becomes slightly harder. Eventually, what began as one moment of hesitation starts looking like personality. I'm just a procrastinator. I'm terrible with relationships. I never finish anything. I'm not disciplined. But labels can hide mechanisms. And if you cannot see the mechanism, you may spend years attacking your character instead of understanding your behavior. There is another reason we sabotage ourselves that is even more subtle. Success itself can feel threatening. That sounds absurd until you consider what success can require. If your project succeeds, expectations may increase. If you receive the promotion, people may expect more from you. If your relationship becomes serious, you become vulnerable to losing something meaningful. If your creative work becomes visible, thousands of people may suddenly have opinions about it. Failure is painful, but success introduces uncertainty too. Your current life may be frustrating, but at least it is familiar. And the nervous system often prefers familiar discomfort to unfamiliar possibility. This helps explain why people sometimes retreat just as things begin improving. Someone starts losing weight and then abandons the habits that were working. Someone's business begins growing and they suddenly procrastinate on the decisions required to expand it. Someone finally enters a healthy relationship and begins creating unnecessary conflict. From the outside, it appears that they are destroying something good. From the inside, their mind may simply be encountering unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory requires a new identity. This may be the deeper question hiding underneath self-sabotage. Not simply, can I succeed, but who will I have to become if I do? Because every meaningful change threatens something surprisingly powerful: your existing self-concept. Human beings don't merely have habits. We construct stories about who we are. I'm shy. I'm the irresponsible one. I'm never good with money. I'm always overlooked. I'm the person who almost succeeds. These stories can be painful, but after enough repetition, they become familiar, and familiarity can begin feeling like truth. Now imagine reality suddenly contradicting the story. You succeed, someone chooses you, you become disciplined, people respect your work, your life begins changing. Logically, this should feel wonderful. Psychologically, however, something strange can happen. The old identity loses its evidence. And rather than immediately updating the story, the mind may unconsciously begin searching for ways to restore what feels familiar. This is where self-sabotage becomes more than laziness or lack of willpower. It becomes a conflict between the future you consciously want and the identity your mind already knows how to inhabit. And until that conflict is understood, you may continue believing your greatest obstacle is somewhere outside you, when sometimes the door is already open, and the frightening part is walking through it. And once identity enters the picture, self-sabotage becomes much easier to understand. Imagine someone who has spent most of their life believing they are bad at school. Maybe they struggled when they were younger. Maybe a teacher embarrassed them. Maybe their family constantly compared them with someone else. Eventually, a temporary experience becomes a permanent sentence. I'm not intelligent. Years later, they decide to study something difficult. And surprisingly, they're doing well. They understand the material. Their grades improve. For the first time, success seems genuinely possible. Then something strange happens. They stop studying. They miss deadlines. They stay awake the night before an important exam. They create conditions almost guaranteed to reduce their performance. Why? Because failing after trying your absolute best can threaten identity in a way failing after self-sabotage doesn't. If you study seriously and fail, perhaps you really aren't capable. But if you barely study, now failure has an explanation. I could have done well if I'd actually tried. Psychologists sometimes describe this kind of behavior as self-handicapping. You create an obstacle before the outcome arrives. Then, if things go badly, the obstacle protects your ego. You didn't fail because you lacked ability. You failed because you procrastinated. You were tired. You weren't prepared. You started too late. Strangely, the sabotage becomes psychological insurance. It damages performance while protecting the story you tell yourself about what might have happened under perfect conditions. And perfectionism can serve a remarkably similar function. People often imagine perfectionists as individuals with extremely high standards. Sometimes that's true, but perfectionism can also become a sophisticated method of never exposing imperfect work to reality. You rewrite the first paragraph 20 times. You redesign the logo again. You research one more possibility. You wait for the perfect moment. Everything remains almost ready. Because almost ready is emotionally safer than finished. Finished things can be judged. Finished things can fail. Finished things can reveal the distance between what you imagined and what you are actually capable of producing. So you polish indefinitely. The behavior looks like ambition. Underneath it may be fear. This pattern appears in relationships too. Imagine someone who deeply wants closeness but has learned that closeness can be dangerous. Perhaps people they trusted became unpredictable. Perhaps affection was inconsistent. Perhaps vulnerability was punished. Years later, they meet someone kind and emotionally available. Consciously, this is exactly what they wanted. But emotionally, stability feels unfamiliar. So their mind starts searching. Why did that message sound different? Why haven't they replied yet? Maybe they're losing interest. Maybe this relationship isn't right. Maybe I should leave before they leave me. Soon they test the other person. They withdraw. They create arguments. They interpret neutral behavior as rejection. And eventually, the relationship becomes unstable. Now something painful but familiar has returned. The person may conclude, I knew relationships never work for me. But sometimes our predictions become true partly because our behavior helped create them. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy hidden inside many forms of self-sabotage. You expect rejection, so you become guarded. Other people experience your guardedness as distance. They pull back. You experience their withdrawal as proof that rejection was inevitable. The belief survives. And because the belief survives, the pattern can repeat. This is why simply telling yourself to stop sabotaging yourself rarely works. The behavior is often performing a psychological function. It may protect you from rejection, protect you from uncertainty, protect you from shame, protect you from responsibility. protect you from discovering something about yourself you don't yet feel ready to know. If you remove the behavior without understanding the protection it provides, your mind may simply invent another escape route. The Stoics approached this problem from a different direction. Epictetus repeatedly emphasized the distinction between what belongs to us and what does not. The outcome does not completely belong to you. Other people's opinions do not belong to you. Whether everyone approves of your work does not belong to you. But your effort, your judgment, your decision to act, those are much closer to your control. This distinction matters because self-sabotage often begins when we become obsessed with controlling outcomes we cannot guarantee. You want certainty that the business will succeed before starting. Certainty that the person won't reject you before becoming vulnerable. Certainty that your work will be admired before publishing it. Certainty that your decision will prove correct before making it. But certainty rarely arrives before action, so you wait. And waiting feels responsible because it postpones uncertainty. Yet eventually, avoidance becomes its own decision. The project remains unfinished. The application remains unsent. The conversation never happens. The opportunity passes. And perhaps this is one of the most uncomfortable truths about self-sabotage. Doing nothing can feel safer than making the wrong choice. But doing nothing still creates a future. The Stoic alternative was not believing everything would work out. It was accepting that outcomes are uncertain while refusing to surrender responsibility for your own actions. You can prepare carefully and still fail. You can communicate honestly and still be misunderstood. You can love someone sincerely and still lose them. You can produce excellent work and still be criticized. But none of those possibilities require you to abandon yourself before life even gets the chance to respond. And perhaps that is where the pattern begins to break. Not when fear disappears, but when fear stops being allowed to make every important decision for you. So how do you actually stop sabotaging yourself? The first step is surprisingly simple. Stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What is this behavior protecting me from?" That question changes everything. Imagine you have been procrastinating on an important project for 3 weeks. The obvious explanation might be laziness. But look closer. What happens emotionally when you imagine finishing it? Perhaps you picture people judging your work. Perhaps you fear discovering that your best effort isn't good enough. Perhaps success would create responsibilities you aren't sure you can handle. Perhaps finishing means finally deciding what comes next. Suddenly, procrastination begins making sense. Not as a good strategy, but as protection. And once you understand what the behavior is protecting, you can address the fear instead of endlessly fighting the symptom. The second step is to separate discomfort from danger. Your nervous system doesn't always distinguish between the two very well. A difficult conversation feels uncomfortable. Publishing your work feels uncomfortable. Applying for something beyond your current level feels uncomfortable. Being seen trying seriously feels uncomfortable. But discomfort doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong. Sometimes discomfort simply means you have reached the edge of what is familiar. Think about entering cold water. Your body immediately tells you to leave. Every instinct says, "This is unpleasant, get out." But if the situation is actually safe and you remain for a moment, the sensation changes. You adapt. Psychological discomfort can work similarly. You don't need to eliminate the fear before acting. You need to learn that fear can be present without automatically controlling your behavior. This is where small actions become extraordinarily powerful. Suppose you've been delaying a project because finishing feels overwhelming. Don't promise yourself you'll finish everything today. Open the document. Work for 10 minutes. Send one email. Make one decision. Submit one imperfect draft. The purpose isn't merely productivity. You're teaching your nervous system something. I can move toward discomfort without collapsing. Every repetition provides new evidence. And evidence is how identity changes. This matters because you cannot usually think yourself into a new self-concept. You build one. If you've spent 10 years telling yourself, "I never finish anything," repeating, "I'm a disciplined person," in the mirror may not convince you. But finishing one small task does something different. Then finishing another. Then keeping one promise to yourself. Then another. Slowly, the evidence begins contradicting the old story. "I never finish anything" becomes harder to defend. Perhaps identity works less like a permanent description and more like a conclusion drawn from repeated behavior. Change the evidence long enough, and eventually the conclusion must change too. There is another useful practice. Learn to recognize the moment before sabotage. There is often a tiny gap. You are about to work, then you suddenly want to check your phone. You are about to submit something, then you decide it needs another revision. You are about to have an honest conversation, then you think, maybe now isn't the right time. You are making progress. Then one small mistake happens and your mind says, well, I've already ruined it. That moment matters. Because self-sabotage rarely announces itself dramatically. It usually arrives disguised as a reasonable suggestion. Do it tomorrow. Research a little more. Wait until you feel confident. Start again Monday. Don't risk embarrassing yourself. Leave before they can hurt you. The thought may sound protective. Your job is not to immediately obey it. Pause. Then ask, if I weren't afraid right now, what would the next reasonable action be? Not the perfect action, not the heroic action, the reasonable one. Perhaps you send the application. Perhaps you return to the workout after missing 2 days instead of declaring the entire month ruined. Perhaps you let someone care about you without immediately searching for evidence that they will leave. Perhaps you publish work that is good enough rather than protecting imaginary perfection forever. This is where Stoic philosophy becomes remarkably practical. Marcus Aurelius constantly returned himself to the action immediately in front of him, not the entire future, not every possible consequence, not everyone's opinion, the next action, because the future is too large to control. But the next decision is often small enough to choose. And self-sabotage thrives when your attention becomes trapped in imagined futures. What if I fail? What if they reject me? What if I succeed and can't maintain it? What if people expect more? What if I discover I'm not good enough? Your mind can produce these questions indefinitely. There will never be enough thinking to eliminate uncertainty from life. Eventually, action must begin before certainty arrives. And perhaps this is the deepest shift. Stop making success the requirement. Make participation the requirement. Your responsibility is not to guarantee that the project succeeds. Your responsibility is to finish and release the work. Your responsibility is not to guarantee that someone loves you. It is to show up honestly in the relationship. Your responsibility is not to guarantee that every decision is correct. It is to make the best decision available with the information you currently have. This removes one of self-sabotage's favorite weapons, the impossible demand for certainty. You may still fail. You may still be rejected. You may still make mistakes. But failure after sincere effort teaches you something. Self-sabotage often teaches you nothing, because it leaves behind the same unanswered question. What could have happened if I'd actually tried? And that question can follow someone for decades. Perhaps the opposite of self-sabotage isn't perfect discipline. It isn't becoming fearless. And it certainly isn't controlling every outcome. It is becoming willing to stop abandoning yourself whenever uncertainty appears. To remain present when the old escape route opens. To recognize the familiar voice saying, turn back. And occasionally answer, no. Let's see what happens this time. Because your mind may prefer what is familiar. Your fear may prefer what is safe. Your old identity may prefer evidence that keeps the old story alive. But none of them have to make the final decision. You do. And perhaps real change begins at the exact moment you stop asking whether you feel ready and take the next step anyway.